Hi, everybody. I'm Dr. Randy Bach. I'm with the Newton Taxpayers Association. We're here for Taxpayer Talk. Today is October 16th, 2023. So I got the numbers down. I'm really good with numbers as far as remembering the date, my birthday, stuff like that. But we're going to try to deal with a lot of other numbers as well because the numbers keep coming at us. We just managed to fend off an override from the city of Newton, and somehow magically they got the money anyway. So good for them, good for us, bad for us, I don't know. I'm going to try to help source this and figure it out with my honored guest, Mr. Aidan Yaw, whom I have great respect for, and who has had the perhaps interesting occurrence of being on our show. He has a knowledge of finance and is a resident of Newton, and I imagine even a voter. So Aidan, tell us a little bit about yourself and what your thoughts are for Newton currently and in the going backwards for the override and going forwards for the upcoming elections and this and that.
Yep, thank you, Randy. It's great to be on the show. I've been a watcher, viewer. It's an honor to be here on the platform. But you're right, I am a voter. I am a Newton resident. All these things are true. To clarify too, it's actually I've been a current resident in Newton now for 6 years. Prior to that, I lived in California for 10 years. And prior to that, I lived in Newton for 2 years. So I can say that 8 out of the last 18 years, I've been a resident in Newton, in 6 most recently. I live in West Newton. I have 3 children along with my wife, 2 of which are of school age and going to Newton Public Schools.
Excellent.
I like to think that my time living in California has given me a unique perspective, spending like close to a decade there and coming back here, almost like a round trip, has given me certain perspectives, about like what I see here in Newton and juxtapose that to what I saw in California. Yeah, I care very deeply about civics. I take my civic responsibilities very seriously and usually vote in pretty much every election, even when we have like the off-cycle overrides and what have you. I actually even ran for elected office once, and actually I lived in the Worcester area. I ran for a state rep, and that was back in around 2002. So, and that was precipitated by just no one running, an incumbent being running unopposed for I think 2 or 3 elections. So I threw my hat in the ring, got my signatures, and got my name on the ballot. And I think that's one of the things I liked. Hopefully we could talk about today, just about the lack of competition we see in some of the elected races.
Point. So you and I coincide in looking at businesses as part of an angel group, and competition is really one of the crucial factors of success. I mean, it's be awesome. I think Peter Thiel has a book, One and Only, or something like that. What is it called?
One.
Just one. Okay. So if you get to be that one company before anybody else is there, you're going to do well. It seems that there's not that much competition going on in city offices for the most part. Do you have any perspective on that? What's the rationale, reasoning, and so forth?
Yeah, especially I think at the school committee level, you're seeing more and more races that even for like open seats that aren't being contested. And I've been kind of curious, and this happened in my ward too, 2 elections ago, where there was an open seat. Chris Bresky is the current school council representative, and I give him full credit for putting his hat in the ring and for doing it. But he ran unopposed, and he's up for re-election in this election. And he's again running unopposed, and I think we've seen this time and time again throughout the city, and I think it's especially acute at the school committee level. And I'm not sure exactly what are the reasons why, Randy. I suspect it has to do with it's a tough job. I give the school committee members a lot of credit for raising their hands, and like the demands, especially during the budget season, it's not uncommon for them to have to meet every day for a week. And like if you have a day job, I don't know how you do it. So I give full credit for doing that, but I think there's like a broken fundamental aspect there about like, well, what is it about, like, shouldn't we encourage the school committee candidates to be to be able to have a day job or a full-time job and also be school committee members and serve the community. So hopefully there's a better answer there in the future, but I don't come here tonight with that answer.
Yeah, there's an interesting point. I want to get to Newton issues, but this is an article I read maybe 25 years ago, 20 years ago. Jonah Goldberg wrote it, and he was talking about kind of the low voter turnout, as if that's an issue per se. And he said, well, look, Iraq, at the time Saddam, has high voter turnout, 99%. Cuba, 99%. The voter turnout per se is not a good thing. He said, it's nice that people feel comfortable enough that they don't have to run out and vote. So if you have kind of an excess, if you have a big Thanksgiving table and you have, food for 15 and some 17 people show up, it's like, it's not going to really matter to you when you have kind of this excess, this comfort level. And I think we've been kind of the beneficiaries and the proponents of a reasonably successful system, and we have reasonably successful people in the town so that we can do things and just kind of have an autopilot. We have more important things to worry about and let the schools kind of carry on. And we have an expectation that things are just kind of, roll along. And that's, I think, been the case for the most part. I think we have, it doesn't run like that forever, though. No. And I think there have been various groundings, the boat kind of hitting sand or rocks and so forth, as we've seen, in my view, in the schools and whatnot. There's been a huge kind of reduction of enrollment in the schools. I think 14% reduction during the COVID years, and that bespeaks something. Then there's also the kind of the political aspect. I don't want to spend a lot of time on that because we've done other shows on this. But, I'm going to, I know your name's Aidan Yaw, but I'm going to call you Joe Q. Voter here today. At least once, and I'm just curious, what motivates your household, say your wife and you? What are the conversations amongst you and your friends about how to vote, and what's the perspective on this upcoming municipal election, 2023?
Yeah, that's a great segue because I certainly, because, and as I mentioned in my opening introduction, I have school-age children, and and one of the reasons why we moved here from California is we were using private schooling in California and kind of had mixed feelings about it, feeling the Newton schools were much superior in certainly the public school option. So that's always near and dear to my heart, as well as a lot of other people, I'm sure. And as you mentioned with the override, that definitely drove my decision making, because fundamentally I felt the override I felt was flawed, in terms of its the reasons why it came out to the voters. And also the timing. You mentioned about the timing of votes. I mean, why do we do that in March?
Exactly right.
And that it was almost like that was announced like just within days after the November regular election. So it was already planned, right? Yeah. So, but that's not what your question was. But I think front and center is certainly some of the things regarding the zoning. I think we're definitely seeing a kind of two factions emerging on the council in terms of, are you pro-development, or I think it's kind of like different shades of gray. No one's 100% on either direction, but are you more a development favoring or not?
Or a lot. And, the example I've used for a different context, people ask me all the time about the COVID vaccines and whether I'm pro-vax and anti-vax. And I've given out thousands of vaccines. I've taken dozens of vaccines myself. I take the flu shot every year, et cetera. But I kind of put the analogy as like pro-clothing. Okay, am I pro-clothing? Well, yeah, I'm wearing clothing. I like clothing. I like to pick up my clothing. But I also like to have the right clothing for the right time. So if I'm on the beach and somebody comes along and I'm wearing a bathing suit and somebody comes along with 5 parkas and 12 boots and all this kind of stuff, every piece of clothing, I mean, that person is wearing the wrong amount of clothing and probably a little bit off in one way or another. And so my feeling is that it's not, I'm not anti-clothing by not putting everything on. And in this case, I'm not anti-growth. I'm not anti-development. But it has to be, in a sense, for the right time, in the right space, and the right growth. We live in a town, Newton, attached to a city, Boston, in the state, Massachusetts, in my civics kicking in, even though I'm not a native. And the thing is, I've looked at the numbers, and the numbers show that we have had minimal growth the last 20, 30 years in each of those jurisdictions. And you know, we might have, I don't know if we've lost a congressman or not. New York lost a few. And where do they go? I mean, God bless them, they're gone. Anyway, no, but they go someplace else where people actually go. So there are places that are growing, there are places that are shrinking. I think we've been pretty much, you know, kind of on the mix of not doing either one. So I'm not sure what is exactly the force impetus to have, you know, these sprouts come up, A, and B, you know, this is my own little shtick, but I have this thing called The Covenant, which is actually a great book by James Michener, but The Covenant is basically a pact. You know, it's a compact between people. People who move into Newton have an expectation. They buy a town, they buy the city, they buy the schools, they're buying a house, they're buying a lot, and they're not expecting, say, you know, a 50-story building come up next door to them that moment. They would have bought it in Manhattan, say, or in Boston, so forth. But so, you know, we don't have a homeowners association, but we have kind of this quasi compact or covenant wherein we bought our house with the expectation that we'd be, you know, in a leafy street or something like that, or maybe we bought it in a condo neighborhood. But to have this kind of abrogation of our voting rights and our ability to do self-determination, you know, recalls the Boston Tea Party itself, where there was taxation without representation. I call this zoning without voting. If anybody wants to use that phrase, it's still open for trademark. At any rate, what are your thoughts about the impetus for this housing thing, and do you understand the legal ramifications of the backing for it and how it came about?
Yeah, I mean, it's something I think a lot of people are focusing on this election. I know for that, you know, that is something I am very deeply ingrained with as well, and I've spoken to candidates and current city council members about it. And I guess where I kind of land, it's interesting you bring up the New York comparison, because I think it goes without argument that Newton is a desirable community. Some of us, like, you know, bought into it. Some of which have been raised here. But at the end of the day, I really am starting to really question the kind of the policy of saying, well, the path to like more inclusive home ownership and bigger home ownership in the city of Newton is a path through like rezoning and letting developers building that housing stock. I think as long as you have house values where they are today, I feel like what are we going to become Manhattan eventually? I don't think that's what anyone wants, but I think we're just going to have to come to the realization that this is going to be a desirable community for the foreseeable future, whether it's the schools, the proximity to Boston, right, or all sorts of other things. And I'm not sure, like, I see all the time, Randy, and I live in West Newton. I see there's been a few developments on Austin Street where a single family house is taken down, maybe call it $1 million house. Right. And then what gets put in its place are 2-unit dwellings that are selling for $2.5 million each. How did that just solve the housing crisis? I mean, granted, it's another unit of dwelling, but like, did we really accomplish affordable housing in that scenario?
I always find that a problem. You know, there's a thing called, people get this all wrong all the time, but they say begging the question when they mean bringing up a question. But begging the question is when you take the stipulated point and you accept it, and then you move from there. So I always find these begging the questions, like when people have these statements like affordable housing, we don't have affordable housing. Thomas Sowell is an economist, and he said he's always lived in affordable housing from the day he was born, because his parents lived where they could afford to live. He says what you're talking about is subsidized housing, generally speaking, one way or another. Because, you know, in medical school, I lived I shared a little house, a kind of a Sears bungalow kind of house, a couple of roommates. I had a tiny room. I paid $58.33 a month for the entire duration. I was very lucky, but that was affordable. But I was sharing things. Everything was shared. I wasn't expecting to have my own place and so forth. And so, you know, people have this expectation that we're all supposed to have something, and it all has to be affordable. But it has this, you know, sinecure aspect where some people are going to get it, some people are not. And the people who do get it, they have to basically, you know, run down their income appropriately in order to stay within the realm and bounds to get those benefits. So I think it's kind of a counterproductive thing. You know, I don't want to go too far down this rabbit hole, but my parents lived in rent-controlled New York City, and everyone think that's a great idea. Rent control, yes, it's lovely. You control the rent, you know, stay. But what happens is that the landlords, you know, it's kind of like Soviet. You pretend to pay us, we pretend to work. So the rent control is there, but then they don't fix anything, and they leave you alone because they want you out, and then they can bump things up. So it has all these perverse incentives and demands. Sure. And I think when we make all the housing have to go through these rules and ramifications, it makes it more expensive to build regular housing. People have to go through all kinds of rules. I'm not opposed to things growing in a semi-organic way, but this is not organic. I think we feel as if we're being forced. And again, it's Bill H5250. If people want to look it up, and it was an emergency COVID provision during the COVID century, or I don't know how long ago it was, a few years. And somewhere stuck in there, along with like having a bowling alley in Framingham or something like that, and you have to change your socks if you live in Wayland twice a day, whatever. All these kind of picayune things. They have this thing, MBTA communities, and they wipe their hands, and you're going to have like 15% higher density, and in certain areas of the train stops. The trains are not that great here. We have these little trolleys, and I grew up in New York City, and they have a subway system there. But I would maintain that the green these kind of little offshoots, the venules of the Green Line are not a major mass transit formulation, and it's really not fair to have these mass buildings grow up, which just because there happens to be a train station with a little 2-car trolley coming along, and subvert the will and the organic aspect of a town in which we came. That's not a question.
Yeah. Well, I find it curious too, because also, I live really close to the commuter rail line. It's because, my closest MBTA option is that in West Newton, and then there's stations in Auburndale and in Newtonville as well. And one thing I heard recently about the MBTA, requirement is that apparently, I don't know if it's true or not, but that the MBTA was threatening to, or the state, or through the MBTA, was starting to not make those platforms that have been promised for years handicap accessible, right? I don't know if you've ever been up and down those platforms.
A lot, yeah.
Those are tricky on their own, right?
Yeah.
And so that's been dangled out there by our elected leaders for a better part of a decade, right? And now I think we're on the verge of getting that, and now it's supposedly going to pull the rug out because if we don't comply with the MBTA, I don't call it zoning, but MBTA kind of requirements around dense housing around MBTA stations, that they say, well, we're going to pull that. So I feel like we're on some sort of let's make this up as we go along kind of policy that's being kind of dictated by a quasi-state agency, right?
Right.
And it is through the state and through the legislature as well. But you combine that with a lot of the talk about village visioning and what it means to have the villages in Newton, because you mentioned it in your earlier remarks, Randy, or I think alluded to it. One of the appeals I think of Newton is that village character, right? And I love that about Newton. One of the reasons why I came back, it was that I really love that how each village center has its unique quality, a different set of restaurants, a different set of shops. It has its own vibe, right? I don't want to lose that, and I don't think we have to lose that, but I think we got to accept that there's got to be some growth there.
I would get it, sort of, if we lived in, say, maybe Tampa or Miami, whatever, places that are actually, burgeoning, growing. But this is not really the case. There's not a huge demand thing going on, and I think it's all comes under this kind of guilt thing about, skin coloration and class distinctions and whatnot. The sign that there's Save Our Villages versus Newton for everyone. I would stipulate that Newton is for everybody. I have neighbors of varying ethnicities and colors and whatnot, and it's not, it really comes down to, do you have a job? Do you have a way to support this, and whatnot? And anybody can be there, and it's not prohibited. Restaurants that we go to, have staff, and they may not all be living in Newton. Some of them might be in Watertown or whatever. I don't think that's an onerous responsibility on anybody's part to have to do. I grew up in, again, New York City. I grew up in the Bronx, and a lot of people don't even realize this in New York City. We had to take the bus to the train, to the bus, whatever. And when I had to go to Queens, it'd be like a series of 4 or 5 of those things. But you make your way. I had a job one summer, and I spent like an hour on mass transit, whatever. But such is life, and I think people are somewhat inured to that, and that's part of the experience. But I want to get down to brass tacks, because I want to leverage some of your financial knowledge, and we're going to be probably about 8 or 9 more minutes. So I want to cede the floor to you and see if you can dissect out the candidates that are up running. And as the Newton taxpayers, and please come to our Facebook group, we don't comment we don't make endorsements, but you're a Joe Q voter, and you can think about this and tell us what's on the landscape on the citywide and/or other particular elections you might be aware of, and which way do you kind of find people sympathetic to your demands and views. And then lastly, if you want to talk about the extra money that the city had, we can save that for last.
Sure. Yeah, I think certainly is coming into the election. There's a certain at-large votes. I would say in Ward 6, you have I think a very interesting race coming up. With Rena Getz, who's running again against Deb Crossley, who I know and I have a lot of deep respect for. She, I think Deb is kind of a whipping post for a lot of what a lot of Newtonites don't like about zoning. I think she takes an unfair amount of criticism and kind of deflects it from the mayor, and so, but it's going to be an interesting race because I think Rena is her second time running. I think she has a fair amount of support, but I think it's fair to say she's in that kind of I wouldn't say anti-development camp, but it's also, I think, restrained development camp, right? And I've met her a couple times.
And which way do you lean on those concepts? Yeah.
Well, Randy, I kind of feel like I think it's healthy for the community to have a kind of camps in each. What I don't like, though, and I kind of I've seen it in some sitting council members, is kind of this advocacy for market development. And I was particularly frustrated by, I think we all have seen that plot called Dunstan East on Washington Street next to the Trader Joe's, next to the old Armory building, right? Now that's a Chapter 40 development, so that meant they had by right, they could go in and do that. But Mark Development is the developer. Now, they cleared out that section of land, was that 2 years ago now?
Sitting there.
Right, and it's just sitting there. And they kicked out about 20 or 30 small businesses. Some of which never came back, right? Some of which popped up other places with mixed results. But meanwhile, there's a big tract of land there that is just undeveloped, and I think it's very regrettable that that what has happened, Randy. I don't know if you know this or your audience knows this, but Mark Development apparently just doesn't have the financing to move forward on building that. So apparently there was enough money to clear the land, but there is enough money to build it now. I guess, and part of it has to do with the sudden rise in interest rates, which I get. But long story short is that I think we have a lot of apologizing going on for Mark. It's just there's I think a comfort level with Mark and other developers in the city. And I'd like to see a little bit more counterbalance to that, in the council. But going back to your point, I think it's fair to have some kind of mixture on that view, because I think that is the thing that that is the issue that are deciding a lot of our elections. And if we look at the most recent election, I think there was more of a groundswell of the less development, contingent, and they're kind of a rising power on the council. And so I like balance. I like to ask other questions regarding my candidates, of who I'd like to vote for. So I think I've been kind of I've been trying to not be very binary on it. And
how about throw something out? How about throw the B word out? Just kind of recycle and get new people in. Is there any concept to that?
Yeah, I think so, and I've been pretty pleased with that rotation, and I think we're seeing it in, you and I live in Ward 2, right, which has it's not a large seat, but we have Emily Norton, who's vacating the office, and so we have an open race.
Yeah, so
right
going
now.
with that, I think it's fair to say my wife is favoring David Mickley. I met the father of Dan Gaynor. Seemed like a nice guy. For her, she's wants to save our villages, and I think this covenant concept is important. And I always feel as if if there was a way to profit from this, then we should profit as a whole. But I feel that when people have the levers by which they can kind of tweak and give special zoning variances at special times, so forth, it's
dangerous.
Yeah, I think it is the opportunity. It's a moral hazard, I guess they call it, for some people to profit by that. And I just feel as if it's not really cooperative in that sense. So lastly, we have about 4 minutes left, so I want to see if we can talk about, you have a financial background. I want you to, and if you can and will, talk about the financial aspect of the city, the quest for override, and how the mystery money showed up, and where can I find some mystery money in my house?
Wouldn't we all, right?
Yeah, I mean, I just want to know where I can look in the cupboards, or you tell me.
Yeah. It's funny because you talked about mystery money. I was doing a project in my backyard recently and found 100 rounds of unspent ammunition. And they were there to keep if I wanted to. So I didn't get, I of course called the local police, and they responded, it's pretty much harmless. We'll take it off your hands if you want, but it's probably $100 worth of ammunition here. And but so anyway, I did get a windfall, but I didn't profit from it. But going back to what the essence of your question, Randy. I found it very curious that we went through all these machinations about the budget override back, and that was just in March, and then miraculously some of that money got clawed back. Some of that money was found that from other sources, right? Where like that, in retrospect, it would appear that the override wasn't necessary, but I really worry about, because I've seen this happen in some of the school debates where things like, and I paid very close attention, I tuned into school committee meetings and mostly to follow exactly what was going to happen there. Again, because I have 2 children in the Newton public schools primarily, and I found it very disturbing where things where I knew like where there were potential for cuts. And then I was seeing like things, especially I think for Newton South, there were like athletic programs that saying they're going to the chopping block, and I think it was kind of like fake news, but people were kind of using it as an excuse to say, I'm going, like this program's at risk unless people step up, or we're going to cut it anyway.
It's the programs that you like that they advertise as being cut. So whatever it is that you like, it's like no dessert.
No, you're absolutely right.
The broccoli somehow winds up there.
Yeah.
There's never any question about adding these extra posts and adding the assistant to the secretary of ESL or vocational something or whatever. I went to public school in New York City through 6th grade, and my school we had 20 or 30 kids per class. There were 4 or 5 classes per grade, and I wound up administration here and there, not because I was a horrible kid, but because I was kind of the good kid. I rang the bell for the assemblies and all that kind of stuff. So I have to deliver the bell. Our office for that school was a principal, a vice principal, a secretary, and there was a nurse. And that was it, aside from the janitors. If you look at the masthead of any of the web pages for our schools, the teachers are outnumbered by the non-teachers. And so I don't think there's an efficient system. We talked about competition earlier. We're not going to necessarily be able to solve all of these problems because we're ending right now. Any final words for voters as the election comes up? Well, you hit the nail on the head before. I think it's important that you get out there and vote. You may not like your choices, but I think it's important that you get out there and do it. And run. And next time, and maybe and run, especially for school committee. Look when you look at the ballot, on election day in November. Look to see like where there's the vacancies and the non-competition, so like maybe there's a chance that you can do something about it. All right, or know someone. And just for the record, I'm not running. People commend me for running. It's Randy Block who's running. He is a better looking guy than I am, so he also has an L in the middle of his name. Anyway, so I'm going to have to wrap it up with there. Thank you so much, Aiden, for joining us.
Thanks for having me on the show.